I'm a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. This particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon. It was a pretty simple in and out overnighter. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last minute cancel on his part left me on my own. So with a packed bag and car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Due to not leaving the house on time and some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45 p.m., which for those of you who don't backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast. So I figured if I moved quickly enough, I could get to at least 2 or 3 miles into the woods before I had to find a spot to camp. This strategy left me hiking in a very dark trail on my own, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually, it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and set up a camp. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood and managed to get the fire started. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac that I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good at the time. My camp was set, my food was on the fire, and the feeling of unease from the hike in had almost gone away. But I was still a little on edge, a side effect of camping alone in remote areas, I guess. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating dinner when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my campsite. I looked at the tiny rock in shock as I was certain that I was alone on the trails that night. I immediately turned my light on and I shined it toward the area where I had seen the rock come from, but due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for what or whoever had thrown that rock. Not daring to stray too far from the fire that, in hindsight, offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves. Barely inaudible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of the leaves got harder to hear as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got as I came to realize it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I experienced true terror. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line, in the woods. I quickly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife with my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options. Stay here and wait out the night or attempt a 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out here with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light, so I decided to stay and wait out the night there. Eventually it came back though. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could definitely hear it. It sounded like someone slowly walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk too far away and I would lose the sound of its steps, but then, an hour later, maybe 2, it would return, still faint as ever. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer until they were about 7 feet from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small and I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped and everything went totally silent. I sat there still for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was completely alone. I packed my things and speed walked the 3 miles back down the trail that I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked, and I nearly sprinted to it. I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and drove until there was at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see and talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what was written in the dust on the back of my car. Sleep well? A lot of weird things happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in the Chequamegon National Forest in northern Wisconsin. And after our experience, we do not plan to return unless we go with a large group of people. My girlfriend and I are from Chicago, so northern Wisconsin was our go-to place for rest and relaxation. We've done a number of hiking trips in northern Wisconsin and in the UP, but never to this area. We are not backpacking experts, but we have been to a number of national parks and have been out hiking and exploring when we can find time to get away from work. We love getting away from people and relaxing in nature, but this trip made us appreciate the presence of other people around us in unfamiliar places. Our plan was to hike a remote section of the North County Trail. It's a national scenic trail like the Appalachian, but it gets much less use. In some parts of northern Wisconsin, the trail is very remote, and the only access is via logging roads. We planned to hike 15 miles to a backpack shelter, spend the night, and hike back to the car the following day. We spent the night at a friend's house in Wausau, and we set out the next day to the trailhead. As we entered the national forest boundary, we were captivated by the beauty of the thick green forests. I drove slowly along the gravel logging road as we made our way to our parking spot. While we were driving to the trailhead, we passed a couple of people standing next to a parked truck on the side of the road. They appeared to be hillbillies as they had a rusted-out, banged-up pickup truck. As we drove past, I waved, and they stared back without returning the greeting. Friendly people, I thought to myself. After we passed them, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that they were still staring at us. And before we rounded a bend, I glanced back into the mirror again and saw them watching us through the haze of road dust. My girlfriend and I joked about the up north people, but we didn't think anything of the encounter. Aside from them, we didn't encounter anyone else on the remote logging roads, and we found a parking spot about 15 minutes later. There was no one else parked at the trailhead. This was a great chance for us to get some much-needed solitude, fresh air, and relaxation. After parking and making sure the car was locked, we hoisted our packs and set off on the trail. The weather was relatively cool, which thankfully kept the mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. We took pictures along the way, and we marveled at the lushness of the forest and the topography of the glacial moraine. After a solid 8 hours of hiking, we found our campsite. It consisted of a wooden backpack shelter and a fire ring. Even though the shelter provided ample space for us, we opted to set up our tent in a small clearing about 100 feet behind the shelter. We built a fire at the fire ring and boiled water for our dehydrated food. As we ate, we watched the sky slowly turn dark. We settled into our tent and looked through the pictures we took that day. After lugging a heavy backpack for 15 miles and drinking some wine, I was ready for some shut-eye. When we camped at state and national parks, I usually wore earplugs. But that night, there were no RVs or other campers to make noise, so I closed my eyes and let the sound of the forest lull me to sleep. My girlfriend was very uneasy that night, but she normally had some apprehension whenever we were sleeping away from home. I'm not sure when we drifted to sleep, but we awoke to a bone-chilling sound. It was pitch dark outside, and over the insects in the forest, I heard a dull thud. It sounded like someone was hitting 2 logs together. My girlfriend and I were wide awake at this point, and we lay silently in our tent, hearing the noise again and again. Our old tent had mesh windows, but the backpacking tent we were using had no window. We could only guess at what was making the sound outside of our tent. We initially thought that an animal got at our food or garbage bag, which we left in the shelter, but this noise was too distinct, and it didn't sound like rustling through food wrappers or our camp equipment. Our hearts were pounding as we heard the persistent knock in the darkness. Unarmed and scared shitless, we didn't know what to do. I would normally have carried a can of bear spray, but I decided to leave it at home to save on weight, against the wishes of my girlfriend. The knocking continued, but we remained still as to not give away our location. For all we knew, whatever was making that noise had already spotted our tent. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocking sound ceased. We lay in complete silence with only the dull buzz of insects in the background. Then we heard it. Leaves rustling, branch breaking, voices. We heard low talking in the distance. We couldn't make out what was being said, but it sounded like a couple of people talking in the distance. The voices continued for a bit, but to our relief, the voices didn't seem to be getting any louder. Whoever was out there didn't spot the tent, or decided to leave us alone. We sat in our tent for the rest of the night, adrenaline surging through our veins. At the first light, we slowly got out of the tent. I looked around in all directions to see if anyone was out there, but I only saw the forest and the backpack shelter. We quickly rolled up our sleeping bags and packed up our tent. When we got to the shelter, my girlfriend screamed in horror. On the entrance to the shelter, the wood was freshly cut. The word "kill" was cut into the shelter wall, and there was a number of axe and knife cuts where someone was chopping at the wall. I looked at the ground and you could see the scattering of fresh wood splinters. After grabbing our food supply and garbage bag, we got the hell out of there. We were nearly jogging with our gear as we made our way back to the car. I kept glancing over my shoulder and gazing out through the woods to see if anyone was following us. We traversed the wilderness that we saw the day before, and we knew when we were getting close to our car. We were quietly rejoicing as we neared the trailhead. We made it back to the trailhead in near record time, but something was wrong. The windshield wiper on my car was sticking straight up, and there was something stuck to the wiper. As we inched closer to the car, I saw there was blood smeared on the windshield, and a squirrel carcass was impaled on the wiper blade. Hair and blood still stuck to the wiper and on the hood of the car. I didn't bother cleaning off the car. We threw our gear in the trunk, and I sped off without removing the animal from the wiper blade. As I sped down the gravel logging road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I could not see anything through the cloud of dust in the road behind the car. When we got to a gas station by the nearest town, I removed the carcass with a wad of newspaper, and I tried to remove as much of the dried blood as I could. I filled up on gas, and we didn't stop until we made it to Milwaukee. This was the last trip I took to the woods of northern Wisconsin. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as the Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates. Stories of cult activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of things you hear about any place that's old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years ago. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on, the rest was history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of the Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambiance to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so traveling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area, a few ritzy houses surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller ones that split off in other directions. Ultimately, the trails culminate, after a few miles or so, at the base of a steep hill adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. When we arrived, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead. It was around 1 a.m. at this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually, he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to get set up for his next shot. At this point, the trail had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail wasn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there. So we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. After a few minutes, an old truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis with an entirely missing truck bed. Growing up in the country, I knew it as the type of truck typically owned by backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails. The roar of the engine echoed throughout the canyon. Clearly we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave toward the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to even hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it out to the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. At this point, it was around 3 a.m. Dave decided he had all of the shots he needed, so we packed up our equipment and continued heading back before it got too late, seeing as how we all had class in just a few hours. Just as we prepared to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging to plants and rocks. As the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. It was our footprints. As my friends and I huddled together, watching in complete terror, another man wearing a long, dark parka emerged from the brush right where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently, he had been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us and following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word they said. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure that the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back to the car, down the canyon, and back to our campus, just in time for class. If you enjoyed these stories, please remember to like, share, and subscribe.